Well, today before taking up the text of Book 1, Canto 4, page 63, I'd like to read out to you something from the Mother. This is a comment that the Mother gave on 23rd July 1969, and I suppose it is from the agenda. I don't have the details of the reference, but this book is called The Mother on Savitri. It's a Savitri Foundation compilation, and I'm going to read out from page 138. It's an interesting note. This sadhak asked the Mother, I used to have the habit of reading Savitri or one of your books before going to bed at night. But now I have lost the habit, and I do not even go to the Samadhi very regularly. I do not understand the true value of these things. Should one do them regularly or only when one feels like doing them? Why should one do these things, and how should one do them? That is a very pertinent question asked by many. Why should we go to the Samadhi and all that? The Mother's answer: one reads Savitri to develop one's intelligence and to understand deeper things. One concentrates at the Samadhi to grow in devotion and to put oneself in contact with Sri Aurobindo in order to receive his help. If these things have any value for you, you must do them regularly, because it is the laziness of unconsciousness that keeps you from doing them. You are born for a spiritual and conscious life, but perhaps you are still too young to have the will to realize it. Yeah, I brought this letter because it is directly connected with our own reading of Savitri. Savitri has many dimensions, as you know. But when distinguishing between Savitri and the Samadhi, the Mother is clear: one reads Savitri to develop one's intelligence and to understand deeper things. One concentrates at the Samadhi to grow in devotion and to put oneself in contact with Sri Aurobindo in order to receive his help. I have heard many arguments against the need to go to the Samadhi every day. Because people think that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother are available everywhere and anywhere. So what is the need and necessity to go to the Samadhi? Well, I knew this answer long before, but today when I was looking into the book as a preparation for your class, I thought it's a very significant thing that all these mental justifications are nothing but laziness of unconsciousness that keeps you from doing them. You see, in some other context, it was asked, what is the difference between the life divine and Savitri? Now, I don't think it was asked to the mother directly, but I read somewhere. And I thought it was a very good explanation based on Sri Aurobindo's own saying that the life divine is the metaphysical understanding of integral yoga. He calls it the metaphysical basis of integral yoga. So it is a necessary thing for us to know what is the basis of this yoga, which again many people in India at least believe it to be quite a repetition of the old yogas, except for the element of the transformation of the physical. But I'm afraid it's not so, and we will see it in Savitri itself. It is true that the life divine is the metaphysical basis of the synthesis of yoga, but it is I would say, I would say, the mind at its most brilliant aspect. I mean, it's a reach of the mind between the mind and the overmind. It is largely, I'm not saying everything, seems to have been written from a kind of an overmental consciousness, where there is a kind of what the mother would call a global vision. That's why we are not able to understand the life divine so very easily, because it is not a mental, linear, logistic, analytical vision. It's a global vision. That means you have so many views in one paragraph. It's not like the normal readings, we explain one thing, we go to the next sentence. It's not a logically connected sentence. He kind of gives in one sentence from one angle, the other one from one angle, the another one from another angle. So the mind is kind of confused as to what Sri Aurobindo wants to say. So that, I would say, is a global vision given from a over mental view. But when we come to Savitri, although the mother writes, one reads Savitri to develop one's intelligence and to understand deeper things, in the light of what Sri Aurobindo would say, even this understanding of deeper things cannot be there without some basic experience behind what you are reading. People have read it as a novel, people have read it as an introduction to Sri Aurobindo. But as we know, the mother herself telling us, there has to be some kind of a deeper contact, if not experience. But one major difference that you will find between the life divine and Savitri is that in the life divine, two elements, I wouldn't use the word missing, but are not stressed upon. Of course, one fact is completely missing, the factor of the mother. There's hardly any description of the mother there, of the Aditi, of the Shakti. Philosophically, he does explain in one of the chapters where he calls the Brahman, Maya, Purusha, Prakriti and Ishvara, Ishwari. There he conceptually explains what is Ishwari, what is Prakriti, what is Maya. That means the Shakti aspect. But bringing in the element of the mother as the incarnation of the divine, that is not to be found in the life divine. Which means that for yoga, for practicing yoga, for doing yoga, we essentially come to Savitri, again the synthesis is the path. It's a very clear path that we need to take. But even in the synthesis, there is the absence of the Divine Mother. You see, it's a beautiful trilogy, if I can say. Life Divine, you have the metaphysics. In the synthesis, you have the path, especially there's a tremendous emphasis on the aspect of surrender. And yet, the Mother, the Divine Mother, is not there in the synthesis too. So the Divine Mother, who is the goal, she is personified in Savitri itself. So that way we consider Savitri a more comprehensive manifestation of Sri Aurobindo's consciousness, because there is philosophy, there is the path, and there is the goal, the Divine Mother. So, the Divine Mother to whom we need to surrender. So you see, the surrender again is not that much emphasized in Savitri as much as it is emphasized in the synthesis. But I suppose, as we said, this is a trilogy: philosophy, path of surrender in the synthesis, and the goal of surrender in Savitri. So hugely Savitri becomes the quintessence of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. And if that is what Sri Aurobindo, the Mother, is explaining, that we need to understand deeper things, read Savitri. But then, above all, there is the person, there is the author, there is the poet. And that's where, she says, one concentrates at the samadhi to grow in devotion. You see, we may have read the whole of Synthesis of Yoga 10 times, but we need to grow in this devotion. The question of surrender or rejection or aspiration, mental purification, all that is described. Unless and until that bhakti bhav, the devotional aspect, is awakened, all this reading comes to nothing. So because ultimately there's got to be this devotion and to put oneself in contact with Sri Aurobindo. Because it was in 69, but later on we say Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. So the samadhi is there for a direct contact and for growing in devotion. And I suppose for us here in Auroville, we should not forget our roots. Our roots are there in the samadhi. We may have all the idealism of human unity and all that here being practiced or attempted at. But as the Mother herself emphasized, that Auroville has to be built on the yoga of Sri Aurobindo or the karma yoga of Sri Aurobindo. We shan't forget the source. And as far as my ignorance goes, not many people are even aware of the ashram, very tragically. Not that I am trying to comment or judge, but what I would like to stress is that when the Mother is telling us so much about the samadhi, I think we should make it a point to contact the source. It's not that daily we can do that, as she says in the ashram, but from the consciousness level, if we can go to the samadhi, there is a personal aspect of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, of course. So I feel without connecting to the source, it may be a little, we may take time. You may say, well, isn't the Mother and Sri Aurobindo universal? And I know all that philosophy of that universal presence. In fact, to reinforce what I am saying, It was in 1969, the same year, that this letter is there. Of course, mine was around November or October. I just finished my higher course at the ashram. That means the studies at the ashram. And I had an opportunity to have Mother's darshan. And I asked her the same question. I said, Mother, because I was planning to go out to Hyderabad for further studies. And I asked her in different words perhaps, but the same question, Mother, do we have to come to Samadhi for seeking your help or Sri Aurobindo's help? There she made a little distinction. Very interesting. Now only I realize that. She said, the divine is there everywhere to help. So you don't have to really come down and bow your head at the Samadhi to seek divine's help. He is there everywhere. But then she added saying, but we have prepared the atmosphere here for psychic realization. We have prepared the atmosphere here. So she does make a distinction that the divine help is there anywhere and everywhere in the world. But if you want to, and then she said, essaie de contacter ton âme, ça vaut la peine. She says, try to connect your soul. It's worth the trouble. So now I realize by reading this that the divinity, the divine help as a universal divinity is there. Of course, you can contact the Divine Mother or Sri Aurobindo or the divine aspect. But there's a specific Mother Sri Aurobindo atmosphere where they say, we have prepared. The word she said is, we have prepared the atmosphere here for a psychic realization, or ton âme, pour la réalisation de ton âme. So, of course, that âme, I'm putting it as psychic and not the soul. So then I understood, yes, you can feel the presence of the Mother of Sri Aurobindo any part of the world because of your devotion. But I see now here how the Samadhi, one concentrates at the Samadhi to grow in devotion and to put oneself in contact with Sri Aurobindo in order to receive his help. We are constantly praying for the Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's help, and that, of course, is the source, is the dynamics. So before coming to the class, when I was reading that, I said I would like to share it with you because we in Auroville, because I'm calling myself we because, yes, I was there in 1968 and I joined Auroville in 1970. So even then we had made it a point that every day I was living at aspiration. But it was a great joy to go to the Samadhi in the evening hours or morning hours sometime. So we used to feel the direct relation, the connection. Well, that is one thing I wanted to share with you, the difference between the life divine, Savitri, and the synthesis, of course. But above all these things, all these readings are on one side, but your going to Samadhi is on the other. So, the newcomers, plus the old people who have been staying here, they know the importance. I think have to be somewhere made aware that there's something called Sri Aurobindo Ashram there's something called Samadhi there's something, because lot many Aurovillians do not find this knowledge even that, there's something called. So I feel it has become mandatory that we should understand the role and the place of Samadhi even for Auroville. Now coming to the text, at the same time, I've caught this idea, maybe Mother has given me this idea from this book, The Mother on Savitri, because the same idea continues in the reading that we have here. You see, last time we started on this paragraph, or with this paragraph, this is the knot that ties together the stars. The two who are one are the secret of all our power. The two who are one are the might and right in things. So this idea of the two who are one actually started on page 61, where there is a single line which says, "There are two who are one and play in many worlds." So this is the repetition that is taking place. There are two who are one and play in many worlds. And then the two who are one are the secret of all power. This whole wide world is only he and she. In fact, these pages that we have read are one more page we need to read about the Purusha and Prakriti. It is nothing but this Leela, the game, the Leela that is taking place between Purusha and Prakriti. And it is this Leela where one feels sometimes Prakriti is lost in Purusha, or the Purusha has hidden himself in Prakriti and has self-lost. So it's a kind of a game of hide and seek. The Purusha hides himself in Prakriti, and the Prakriti looks for him, searches him out, and then brings him forth. So there is a beautiful game, an evolutionary game we may call it, and the Prakriti finding the hidden Purusha or looking for the hidden Purusha is the raison d'etre of this evolutionary process. So here too, I came upon one of the latest books by George Van Breckham. You must have seen this, it's published here. Not published here, but I found it, a friend of mine. The New Spirituality. And here there is an article which I think you should read because it's directly connected with Savitri. An essay called Ashwapati and Sri Aurobindo. And those of you who have heard George, of course, George Breckham, you would know his angle of understanding Mother and Sri Aurobindo. That is, they are the twin avatars or the Kalki avatar. So he also picks up this phrase in this book, in this essay, and he gives a little different emphasis. He says on page 174 of this book, The New Spirituality by George Breckham, "Yet their essential oneness has been declared by themselves on many occasions." You see, what George is doing is that this two that we are seeing here, the two who are one, he is directly relating these two who are one to Mother and Sri Aurobindo. He says it is not the question of Sri Aurobindo telling us about Purusha and Prakriti, which is an old thought in Sankhya philosophy. He says, why should Sri Aurobindo re-emphasize and replay the old record of the Sankhya, where in India, at least in Indian intelligentsia, we know the play between Sankhya, between Purusha and Prakriti. So here he says, no, it is not the play of Purusha and Prakriti. It is themselves, it is their own consciousness. That's why I've been emphasizing it again and again. If you could lay your hands on the 12 years with Sri Aurobindo by Nirod Baran, you'll see the play. So let me read out one or two paragraphs where he brings out the importance of this sentence, the two who are one are the secret of all power, etc. I read out on page 174. Yet their essential oneness has been declared by themselves on many occasions. Sri Aurobindo wrote, for example, the mother's consciousness and mine are the same, the one divine consciousness in two, because that is necessary for the play. And we have the same words here He says, the two who are one and play in many worlds. So focus on the word play. So there is this question of play or the Leela. And for the sake of the Leela, Purusha and Prakriti have taken two different forms. And Sri Aurobindo mentions the same thing exactly verbatim. He says, the mother's consciousness and mine are the same. The one divine consciousness in two, because that is necessary for the play. Precisely the play of manifestation in the evolution. And the mother wrote, without him, I exist not. Without me, he is not manifest. All these days I was thinking he is unmanifest. Maybe I was wrong all these days. So it is he is not manifest, which is a concise formulation of the supreme gnosis in all high spiritual traditions. She also said, Sri Aurobindo and I are always one, and the same consciousness, one and the same person. And these words of hers are directly applicable to the point under consideration. When in your heart and thought you will make no difference between Sri Aurobindo and me, when to think of Sri Aurobindo will be to think of me, and to think of me will mean to think of Sri Aurobindo inevitably, when to see the one will mean inevitably to see the other, like one and the same person, then you will know that you begin to open to the supramental force and consciousness. As I wrote, this is the author is telling, as I wrote in the already mentioned text in the Kalki Avatar, until now and throughout the course of the evolution of life on earth, the avatars have always been of the male gender, and a female avatar may seem rather unorthodox, especially to people familiar of old with the line of male avatars. It is nonetheless obvious that one gender does not represent the full human constitution and condition, nor does it take into account the divine sexless archetype which supports the evolution and directs it towards its goal. Hence the importance of the pages on the two who are one. That means exactly the pages that we are reading. Hence the importance of the pages on the two who are one in Savitri, included in the canto on the secret knowledge, which must be an essential knowledge in our understanding of the world and the work of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. There are two who are one and play in many worlds. In knowledge and ignorance they have spoken and met, and light and darkness are their eyes interchange, etc. That these two are Purusha and Prakriti has been generally understood. The question, however, why Sri Aurobindo would include in his secret knowledge this supposedly well-known concept of the Sankhya school, and a frequent feature in Indic philosophical and spiritual thought, has as generally slipped the mind. Sri Aurobindo's enormously important validation of the manifestation and matter, his turn toward the earth, who also is the divine and must find her accomplishment in her divinization, is one aspect of that new knowledge. If Purusha and Prakriti are another aspect, they must mean more than a traditional philosophical tool of explanation. They too must be part of the great book of change that is Savitri. The crux of this matter is that, as Sri Aurobindo and the Mother are avatars, they are the living incarnations of the abstractions of Purusha and Prakriti. This in itself is reflected in the magnificence of Sri Aurobindo's pages on the relationship of Purusha and Prakriti, the two who are one, which is high philosophy and at the same time one of the most beautiful love songs ever written, and which gives the fundamental rationale of the manifestation of the one. Their Leela is the Leela of the one. The Leela of the one is their Leela. Of course, there's a long passage, but this is what refers to our passage. And so I think he has given us a very good emphasis on this passage, telling us that it's a long description. You have seen it's almost 4 pages. But as I explained in my first class on this passage, It is a divine song, it's a song of the love, which was captured by Gita Govinda, I mentioned it to you earlier, by one of our Indian poets long back. But that Gita Govinda, which also is apparently very sensuous, and Sri Aurobindo says, no, it has nothing to do with sensuality, it's all a symbolism of spiritual love, of the psychic being and the supreme divine. So too in these passages, which in the beginning may verge upon some kind of a sensuality, is also not sensuality, but a play of Purusha and Prakriti. And it goes further to say that this play is nothing but the play of Mother and Sri Aurobindo as consciousness, because they too are the same consciousness as Purusha and Prakriti are one and the same consciousness. In the manifestation, they have come as Purusha, he, and Prakriti, she. But that's only for the manifestation's sake. But in their origin, there's no he and she. There's only one consciousness. So too, we must remember all this description is of this split in manifestation. In the origin, the two are the same. In fact, today, if I have some time, we will take up that passage where Sri Aurobindo tells us about that origin. So I'll give this passage a quick reading because it's more or less the same divine play that's being described. I hope you have found the passage on page 63. So we had done this till the line, yet none would leave because of his delight. And we had a beautiful reading from the mother. His works, his thoughts have been devised by her. His being is a mirror vast of hers. Active, inspired by her, he speaks and moves. His deeds obey her heart's unspoken demands. Passive, he bears the impacts of the world as if her touch is shaping his soul and life. His journey through the days is her sun march. He runs upon her roads. Hers is his course. A witness and student of her joy and dole, a partner in her evil and her good, he has consented to her passionate ways. He is driven by her sweet and dreadful force. His sanctioning name initials all her works. His silence is a signature to her deeds in the execution of her drama's scheme, in her fancies of the moment and its mood, in the march of this obvious ordinary world, where all is deep and strange to the eyes that see, and nature's common forms are marvel wefts. She, through his witness, sight and motion of might, unrolls the material of her cosmic act. Her happenings, they exalt and smite the soul. Her force that moves, her powers that save and slay, her word that in the silence speaks to our hearts, her silence that transcends the summit word, her heights and depths to which our spirit moves, her events that weave the texture of our lives, and all by which we find or lose ourselves. Things sweet and bitter, magnificent and mean, things terrible and beautiful and divine. Her empire in the cosmos she has built. He is governed by her subtle and mighty laws. A very long sentence, but you can see the essence is there. That the Purusha has surrendered himself to Prakriti. I would say surrendered, and also the aspect of hidden. You see, try to keep this in mind. It is not a game between man and woman or he or she. It's the game of Prakriti which is evolving, and the divinity that is hidden in Prakriti right from the beginning. So this is a play that Sri Aurobindo is describing not when it comes to the human level. He is describing the play of Purusha and Prakriti right from the genesis of evolution itself. In the beginning, Purusha, the consciousness, is dormant, is not active. So the Prakriti takes over the evolutionary movement because of its force, because of all these actions and activities, motion of mind, everything. So the Purusha, the consciousness, is dormant, he is just witnessing, he does not participate. He is letting the force go on. So whatever the Prakriti does, Purusha is almost saying, all right, you keep going, you keep going. At least in that silent approval. Because there is, at the same time, Sri Aurobindo would explain that although right from the inconscient level there seems to be only the energy, the force, the Prakriti that's moving, it is not that it is without a guide and a guardian. There is a secret consciousness giving a kind of a remote direction. So Prakriti, the energy is moving in the right direction, but the only thing is, it takes eons, millions of years, because it wastes a lot of energy not knowing exactly what is the direct and the shortcut to the evolutionary movement. But then that's how he explains, when Prakriti, the energy has come to the level of man, then the consciousness, the divinity comes forth as the psychic in us and says, now I will see that Prakriti will not waste time. I can give nature, Prakriti or the energy, the proper direction. That is why metaphysically Sri Aurobindo emphasizes on the importance of the realization of the psychic being, so that consciousness in man can take over the game of Prakriti, which has taken billions of years, wasting its time. But now, if only we can listen to that voice and overcome Prakriti, then there would be a hastening of the movement of evolution. So it is that movement that is being described right from primordial evolutionary time to the present time. So all these lines which have a different shade, different meaning, are essentially the same. So I'm not going line by line, I'm just giving you the feel of that. Her empire in the cosmos she has built, he is governed by her subtle and mighty laws. His consciousness is a babe upon her knees. Is a babe because in the evolution the consciousness is very small, is very young. Her endless space is the playground of his thoughts, his being a field of her vast experiment. She binds to knowledge of the shapes of time and the creative error of limiting mind, and chance that wears the rigid face of fate, and a sport of death and pain and nescience. His changed and struggling immortality. His soul is a subtle atom in a mass, his substance a material for her works. His spirit survives amid the death of things. He climbs to eternity through being's gaps. He is carried by her from night to deathless light. Yeah, these two lines maybe we should halt a little bit. He climbs to eternity through being's gaps. He is the consciousness. And when it comes to the human being, he is the soul, the psychic being. So he, the psychic being, is moving towards eternity through being's gaps. Gaps are the internatal gaps, the gap between one birth and another birth. There is a period of rest, which all of you know very well in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. That the being, the soul, the psychic being, it has a long journey once it leaves the body. Maybe as longer even than when it had a journey when it was in a body. So that's why we call it the journey after death. Because it is extremely long period depending on the evolution of the soul and depending on our own sadhana in the body. However, that I'm not getting into that detail, but it takes a long time. And once after it reaches its psychic world, it takes rest, a kind of a rumination that takes place. So there is a kind of a gathering of all that it did in the previous life. It's not the question of conscious memory, But those Godward moments, those luminous moments when you are in contact with the higher consciousness, those are the only psychic moments that the soul takes with it. Rest of all that we have done, big, small, chota, mota, big, poor, rich, nothing matters. Only those moments when we were one little spark of a time when we touched the divinity, that is made a part of the psychic being. So those moments are part of the psychic. Rest of the work that we do upon earth have no significance for the psychic being. It's a lost gain. So it gathers all those moments and then it decides once again where to take the next birth, which place, what experience, which country, which family, which place. So that's a kind of a detailed thing. But that's what Sri Aurobindo means here. He climbs to eternity through being's gaps. I think those of you who came for the darshan this time, I don't know if you got the message. Do you have darshan message? Don't have it. Martin, do you have the message? Darshan message do you have, Martin? Long message. Yeah, it was a lovely message. Marish, is the message with you? Okay, God. The essence of it was this. Very long. It's a pretty long message, the longest one we have received till now. It's very interesting. She says, once you have contacted, touched the divine consciousness, it says, then you are sure to arrive at it sooner or later. She says, in between you may go against the divine. She says it doesn't matter. Against the divine in the sense we are not that becoming asuras or anything, but we may have gone off the path, off the spiritual path. We may be meandering. But then she says, once you have touched that inner divinity, you are sure to arrive after many births or some months or births, or some months or years of birth or lives, but you will arrive. So it's the question of your initial contact with the divine. So that's what I really see here. He climbs to eternity because she says you will get back to the divine. So that is the eternity. Come what may, but you will. It's a question of number of lives. That's the only difference that would be there between one person and another person. So that is the eternity. He is carried by her from night to deathless light. This grand surrender is his free will's gift. And we know some people have even made research. The word surrender itself comes in Savitri a few times, not many times, like we have in the synthesis. There's one surrender here, one before when Ashwapati is speaking about this, the deep surrender was his only strength. I mean, not too many times. Vast surrender. So it's only a few times that the word surrender is mentioned. That's why I said synthesis is the path. But the Savitri is the goal. So, his pure transcendent force submits to hers in the mystery of her cosmic ignorance, in the insoluble riddle of her play, a creature made of perishable stuff, in the pattern she has set for him he moves. He thinks with her thoughts, with her trouble his bosom heaves. He seems the thing that she would have him seem. He is whatever her artist will can make. Although she drives him on her fancy's roads, at play with him as with a child or slave, to freedom and the eternal's mastery, and immortality stand above the world, she moves her seeming puppet of an hour. You see, that is in fact, that's our situation. We are the puppets in the hands of the nature. It is nature who is moving us. We think that we are the movers, I am the thought, I am the feeling. But we are only a puppet. And at this time the puppet is also, the consciousness is also puppet because it has not yet awakened. Because he uses the word puppet, I think we have a line later, I'll come to that, let me read it out. Even in his mortal session in body's house, an aimless traveller between birth and death, ephemeral dreaming of immortality, to reign she spurs him. He takes up her powers. He has harnessed her to the yoke of her own law. His face of human thought puts on a crown. You see, there's a very significant phrase, if you have noted that. To reign, she spurs him. You see, the nature is doing all this only to awaken the dormant psychic being, saying, you wake up, you take up the lead. After all, I am not the leader. I am only a force, an energy. But consciousness is the essence. So she is doing all that. Even when she says that all these problems and difficulties and suffering come to us, the only means is to, only meaning is to spur, is to wake up this inner divinity. So that's what she's saying. He takes up her powers. He has harnessed her to the yoke of her own law. His face of human thought puts on a crown. Held in her leash, bound to her veiled caprice, he studies her ways, if so he may prevail, even for an hour, and she work out his will. He makes of her his moments passions serve. To obey she feigns, she follows her creature's lead. For him she was made, lives only for his use. This is the central philosophy of the relation between Purusha and Prakriti. That this entire nature is only for him, for Purusha, for the divinity, for the soul. So the function of nature is to awaken the Purusha. And once the Purusha awakens, he will take the lead. Then you will say, at last he wakes to a memory of self. S capital. At last. After births and births and births. After all the struggles, after all the voyage. Then he says, nothing without her he can, she rules him still. At last he wakes to a memory of self. He sees within the face of deity, the Godhead breaks out through the human mold. Her highest heights she unmasks and is his mate. You see, this is the culmination. When the soul within us wakes up, he transcends, and on that Paraprakriti, Aparaprakriti, whatever the higher nature of divine, there it says, her highest heights she unmasks and is his mate. When is nature, Prakriti, the mate of Purusha? On the higher supramental levels. Below that, there is, until the level of the mind, there is absolute ruling of the Prakriti. From the mind beyond, there slowly Purusha wakes up. He takes the lead. But on the level of the supermind, where Purusha and Prakriti, consciousness and energy, they get the equal status. There is no dominance of one over the other. On the supramental level, there is the equality of Purusha and Prakriti. So till then, he is a plaything in her game. Till then is still a supramental level. Her seeming regent, yet her fancy's toy. A living robot moved by her energy springs. He acts as in the movements of a dream. An automaton stepping in the grooves of fate. He stumbles on, driven by her whip of force. His thought labors, a bullock in time's fields. His will he thinks his own, is shaped in her forge. Obedient to world nature's dumb control. Driven by his own formidable power, his chosen partner in a titan game. Her will he has made the master of his fate, her whim the dispenser of his pleasure and pain. He has sold himself into her regal power, for any blow or boon that she may choose. Even in what is suffering to our sense, he feels the sweetness of her mastering touch. In all experience meets her blissful hands. On his heart he bears the happiness of her tread and the surprise of her arrival's joy. In each event and every moment's chance. All she can do is marvelous in his sight. He revels in her, a swimmer in her sea, a tireless amateur of her world delight. He rejoices in her every thought and act, and gives consent to all that she can wish. Whatever she desires, he wills to be. The Spirit, the innumerable One, he has left behind his lone eternity. He is an endless birth in endless time, her finite multitude in an infinite space. So here we have come to the end of this passage, where we have seen, as I said, explained the game, the Leela between Purusha and Prakriti, between force and energy. It has been a long passage, as I said again and again, but please understand, it is not on the human level of man and woman. It is on the level of consciousness and Shakti. And this is the play that is happening since times immemorials, in the beginning of evolution. And there is a semblance of this game where the Purusha gives in, surrenders everything to the Prakriti, because there's a line later which I think I will come across, where it says, in the beginning Purusha gives in to Prakriti and makes her feel independent, makes her feel that she can do anything and everything. But then that is a point only to gain her confidence. Once he gains the confidence of Prakriti, then he starts transforming her. You see, in the beginning, if you talk of transformation, Prakriti may resist. Prakriti says, why should I obey you? I am my own master. I have a lot of energy and all that. But then Purusha says, go on. If you think you have all the energy, go on. But there comes a point where nature feels, I cannot move forward. I need knowledge, I need consciousness. And there, at that point, she would appeal to Purusha to guide her. That is the level of man's birth, where man comes forth to say, okay, I will help you. So this is the different figures are there, lovely descriptions. But then we come to the real philosophy. The last line that he has said, the Spirit, the innumerable One, he has left behind his lone eternity. He is an endless birth in endless time, her finite multitude in an infinite space. Now I jump a few lines on that page. I come to page 67, because this is the space I was looking for. There is a new para beginning with the absolute, the perfect, the alone. So from there to the end of the para, there are about 35 lines, and this is one of those most intense philosophic passages of entire Savitri. In fact, I would even go to the extent of saying it is the essence of the life divine. If you want to know in 35 single poetic lines that magnanimous life divine, read just these 35 lines, memorize these lines, and brood upon these lines. You will see the whole philosophy of the life divine. So here are those magic lines, mystic lines, philosophic lines. And you see the rhythm. You see, till now we had a very beautiful, light, romantic, very easygoing rhythm. But suddenly when we come to this para, it's almost, I don't know how he wrote it. Maybe we should read Nirodh Baran and see how he has written this passage. It's a kind of a one single flow of inspiration. He didn't stop anywhere in these 35 lines. It's that one majestic rhythm is there. And this line again, you see, it seems to be quite a contradiction of the previous passage. You see, there he was describing love, describing play, the Leela, Leela between Purusha and Prakriti. But suddenly he switches over to an extraordinarily intense and dense thought. It's a kind of a, it's not even thought, it is a vision, it's a kind of a knowledge. And so he has changed his mode completely, and you see the very first sentence he says, the absolute, comma, the perfect, comma, the alone. And the line comes again, after 4 or 5 lines, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. Third time again it comes, the absolute, the perfect, the immune. A poet like Sri Aurobindo would not repeat line like that. But obviously there is a meaning, there is a rhythm, there is a message. And then as I was looking into the future poetry, you see there he says future poetry will be having 5 essential qualities. What he calls truth, beauty, delight, life and spirit. Truth, beauty, delight, then life and spirit. So these will form the essential qualities of future poetry. He wrote long before 1920, in the future poetry. So I think what he has envisaged as future poetry, he has crystallized that in Savitri. So in Savitri we find all the 5. There's truth, there's beauty, there's delight, there's life and there is spirit. And this passage is one of those remarkable passages which crystallizes truth. And truth, it does not mean only the truth that we see of the ordinary day-to-day life. It's a highly metaphysical, philosophical truth, where it is not the truth of the mind, it is not the truth that the mind looks at. It's the truth that brings in synthesis. So Savitri presents that truth which synthesizes. As it says somewhere, the innumerable one, the manyness. So Savitri does contain truths from different levels, especially when you see the book, the argument between Savitri and the god of death. Especially the god of death, he presents all the human philosophies that we have in the world at present, of course, until his time. That means there's a materialist philosophy or religious philosophy or Sankhya philosophy or the Western philosophy. He has presented all the truth. That's the god of death. Because he was speaking on the mental level. So what all philosophies are there on the mental level under different names, god of death presents. But Savitri, she is always superseding. She does not argue on the mental level. She goes beyond the mind. And then she presents, or Sri Aurobindo presents through Savitri, the new philosophy, the new metaphysics. So we have a wonderful dialogue between mind and beyond mind. That's what they represent. So that beyond mind, we have this philosophy of the life divine. So that is the truth. And then the paragraph, the 4 lines that went before, they represent the beauty and the delight, especially the delight aspect, the play between Purusha and Prakriti. So we can pick up passages where there's truth, where there's delight, where there's beauty, and where there's a tremendous life element. A life element that goes into all this throughout the passage. And it's a life element not just about the ordinary life, but a universal life. So you see, I think if somebody should take up this as a thesis and really work on that, these 5 elements of future poetry, where are they found, how are they found in Savitri? It can be really a beautiful study, and it's a study wonderful. Because then you can see Sri Aurobindo's prophecy of future poetry, how it gets fulfilled in Savitri. It's a study, a remarkable study it could be. Well, I'll just give it a quick reading because we don't have much time. We'll take up the explanation next time. But I'm eager to give it a reading to just give you the rhythm of the new poet, of the new thought. The absolute, the perfect, the alone has called out of the silence his mute force. Where she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep the ineffable puissance of his solitude. The absolute, the perfect, the alone has entered with his silence into space. He has fashioned these countless persons of one's self. He lives in all who lived in his vast alone. Space is himself, and time is only he. The absolute, the perfect, the immune, one who is in us as our secret self, our mask of imperfection has assumed. He has made this tenement of flesh his own, his image in the human measure cast, that to his divine measure we might rise. Then in a figure of divinity, the Maker shall recast us and impose a plan of Godhead on the mortal's mold, lifting our finite minds to his infinite, touching the moment with eternity. This transfiguration is earth's due to heaven. A mutual debt binds man to the Supreme. His nature we must put on as he put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as he. His human portion we must grow divine. Our life is a paradox with God for key. Yeah, let's have the